quick question. How many of you, hands, how many of you were not here last night? Not here last night. Wow, that's awesome. All right. Well, I sincerely appreciate your presence, and of course, I am so grateful to Father Ripperger for his presence, for him blessing us with his wisdom. This topic can be a bit challenging, right? But as he has so beautifully explained to us and will continue to explain to us, this is real. This is reality. This is not the boogeyman. This is not stuff that we should be afraid of either, right? And so Father is so graciously helping us to learn what the battle is, what the battlefield is, and what the tools are and the weapons are so that we can fight the battle. So I've given Father's bio, as it were, a couple of times, but in a nutshell, he's just a renowned theologian, philosopher, author, exorcist, obviously, trainer of exorcists, and so we're just so fortunate to have him with us for these 3 days, and I'm fortunate to consider him my mentor and my friend. So with that, please welcome Father Ripperger.
Tonight we want to take a look at what the actual battlefield looks like. Talk a little bit about it. It's part of the complexion that most people are going to deal with in their lives. It has to do with the moral temptation, that ordinary dialogue. That's what everybody is subject to. It sort of deals with suggestions into your imagination, that puts certain perspectives on those things, and they can also move you emotionally in relationship to them. Each time we sin, as I mentioned, we give a little bit more empowerment and ground in relationship to those things. Each time we say no to them and fight the temptation, it becomes weaker so that the next time it's harder for them to move on us. So that's just ordinary dialogue, temptation, ordinary dialogue, influence which everybody is subject to. By varying degrees, obviously, different people have different degrees of that thinking. And there's what we call infestation. This is when demons get into the house, or into a home or some building or location. They can even be in regions. You'll be surprised that the one in California, especially in Los Angeles, is a demon of unreality. Hard to figure out. But it's interesting when you're out there and dealing with caseload, people are so disconnected from reality. And that's one of the things that demons draw. They get into different things. That in most cases, they can also infest animals and objects. So we actually saw this in Scripture. So when Christ sends the demons into a swine, they go into the lake and drown. We still sorry for the guy that lost all his swine. Because it's in the thousands, right? That's what we're talking about. That's quite the sight afterward. But anyway, so they can infest animals and things of this sort. They can attack animals as well, so when things like that, the demons are actually killing the animals on these people's farm. They wiped out 50 animals in the course of a year. They would walk out on the porch and literally their dog would be being choked to death. This is not too common, obviously. In most cases, when you have things that are occurring in the house, like things moving around or people experiencing things at night and things of that sort, it's usually not the house, though. In most cases, like 80 to 90% of the time, it's actually not the house. It's someone in the house. And the way you determine that, and because the demons will attach themselves to somebody's house and then they start messing with the things in the house, the way you determine it is if a particular person in the house leaves and then it follows them, and then all of a sudden things get quiet in the house, or they follow them and they go to, they travel somewhere and it follows them, and that's a sign it's really attached to the individual. And that's actually the case in most circumstances. One of the ways that you can actually keep your house from being infested is just playing chants in the background, burning a candle, an exercise to infest a candle there on a regular basis. Having family prayer on a regular basis will help that significantly as well. Obviously, sometimes there's people can move into a house and have stuff that's there before they get there. Sometimes I recommend that people actually do a little bit of research before they buy a house. One couple I knew bought a house, and the woman that lived there before had done witchcraft because her husband got cancer, and she was doing witchcraft to try and make it better. He ended up dying from cancer, and this demon of illness not suggesting that you bad word about your house. But the point being is that they can actually get in and they can actually infest actual houses. And usually there's a ritual from Milan that we use that actually is extraordinarily effective. There's only been one house and I've had to do it more, so I take that back, 2 houses. I've had to do that more than once. Usually it just blows it out. Okay. So that's just infestation. When you're talking about human beings, though, there's 5 forms of extraordinary diabolic influence, and it's extraordinary in 2 ways. The first is that it's above and beyond what most people are going to experience. It's we're talking about stuff that's much more intense and much more difficult to deal with. Then the second reason it's extraordinary is because it's rare. We'll talk about this when we get to diabolic oppression and obsession. It's becoming more common, much more common than they used to be in the past. But as far as possession, for example, which is one of them, statistically, exorcists have not really noticed that much of an increase. In fact, our general, statistically in 2015, when we first started keeping statistics at the last statistics, which was last year, because we keep track of how many people contact us. So in 2016, we had 600 people contact us. We ended up praying over 150, and out of that 150, only 3 were possessed. A lot of them, the majority of them, had other issues, but this was, possession was very rare. So you talk about the people that contact us, and the statistic holds true, it's only about 0.5% of the people would be possessed. So the statistic hasn't gone up. You would think it would what people are doing. Now, some of that could be that people just aren't asking for help. One of the things I should mention is tonight, especially when we get to possession, we're going to say, you keep mentioning women when it comes to possession. Is there a reason for that? And I tell people there's 2 reasons. One is that women are more victimizable, and they're in the image of Our Lady, and so the demons who hate Our Lady go after them more than men, as a general rule. The other part is that women will actually stop and ask for directions. Most guys also deal with it. There's women aren't getting help, So, and that's one of the reasons why, because women are actually more likely to seek the help than men. I think that's one of the reasons. Statistically, we see more women than men. Okay. The first form of this extraordinary diabolic influence is called dolor in Latin. It just literally means pain. Now, in some books, it's called vexation, but the term vexation can mean any type of diabolic attack whatsoever. But in this particular case, dolor is the prerogative of saints. It's only people who are extraordinarily holy. It's usually never accompanies anybody unless they've reached the 4th or entering into the 5th level of prayer, which is mystical contemplation. So there's touches where they're starting to have mystical contemplation, things of that sort. That's the minimum. This is something, as I mentioned, is the prerogative of saints. And so, and this basically all seems physically accosting the person. Like in the case of Padre Pio, Satan actually beat him several times. He drug him around the room, pulled his shirt off, did all sorts of things in relationship to it. St. John Vianney experienced the same kind of thing. Paul of the Cross experienced it. So there were several saints that actually experienced these kind of things. And exorcists say there's nothing they can do about it other than endure it. And people say, well, why does God actually allow that? There's 2 reasons. One is the person goes through further sanctification by building confidence in God. And that's going to be a refrain you're going to keep hearing from me. Confidence in God is one of the most powerful protections that you can have against diabolic influence. Even when you're attacked, we'll see this when we get to diabolic obsession. Even when you're attacked, if you make an act of confidence in God, you do it consistently, a lot of times that'll just blow it out. And it makes it, because God has, as I mentioned before, all the demons. They can't do anything, literally nothing, unless God allows them to do it. They're on a very short leash. And so you know that how, even in cases of possession, in the worst case of possession, what demons can and cannot do, God moderates them, because allows them to do certain things. And this is something that we have to keep in mind, and that ultimately, if we recognize that He's allowing us into our lives for the sake of our sanctification and purification, we actually can grow holier through it. We see this even in cases of possession. Some of the most holy people I've met are people that came out the other end of possession and fought the battle victoriously and well. And because through that process they developed virtue, they overcame their imperfections, they got a great deal of merit in beating of the demons. In fact, that's one of the things that St. Paul says, engage the ancient serpent to win the crown of glory, so that the people who fight Satan and do it in a proper fashion, God will actually give you a crown in heaven as a sign of that. So the first is that it helps the people that suffer this blow, or it helps them to actually grow holier through the process. The second part about it is that it helps to humiliate the demons. As I mentioned last night, we are the instruments of their justice. One of the things that you probably might hear from time to time, and this is from exorcists who are not very seasoned, but you'll still hear it from time to time, is they will say things like, you should have certain compassion and mercy on demons. That's just completely false. God doesn't, so why should we? Second of all, they deserve every little bit of it. One time, this one demon, I said, hey, because you did this, you're going to have to do this, so I command you to do this. He just stops and looked at me, he was more than one possessor. He said, I didn't do that. So-and-so did that. I said, well, don't you deserve it? Well, yeah, but then do it, right? So they know, in fact, they'll readily admit that the brutal beating that they get during sessions, all the punishment that God meets out of them, is not proportionate to how evil they really are. And so, having compassion and mercy, it sounds like something the demons would try and fake. Don't you have compassion on me? Sorry. You don't have compassion on the people that you're possessing. So, dolor is, as I mentioned, it's not very common. The next is called oppression. This is where demons attack people's externals. And by externals, we mean things such as their health, their finances, their job situation, any kind of relationships that they might have, for example, within their families, among their children, among their spouses, and they can attack any of those. They can actually even destroy people's property and things of this sort. This diabolical oppression, we used to not see it too often, but it's becoming more frequent because of the rise of witchcraft. The more that witchcraft and Satanism are taking place, and all these kids are getting involved, but we're starting to see that demons are becoming empowered, so they're attacking people in the neighborhoods and things of that sort. To give you an idea of how this, that your health, now, let me be clear, not all health issues are diabolically caused. In fact, the majority are not. So if you have a health issue, I tell people to go to a doctor. That should be your first thing you should do. But there are certain kinds of health issues that are just simply not connected to an authentic issue in relationship to the person's health. It's actually diabolic. So in Memphis, these people have this idea that I have the gift of healing. I got nothing of the sort. In fact, people tell me, well, you're an exorcist. What charismatic grace you got? I tell them, nothing. Nothing. Literally nothing. I've walked in, he was like, aren't you sensitive stuff? No, I've walked into fully infested houses like things fine to me. And then later I do the prayers and this stuff starts happening, right? I tell people I'm a grinder, right? So I have to do the prayers for a while and grind it out before the demons really start doing too much. Okay. And quite frankly, I'm kind of glad I don't have charismatic grace. Because frankly, I think it helps me to be a little bit more objective. As I mentioned last night, demons will have objective criteria, not the subjective. In fact, one of the things that's very dangerous in relationship to charismatic graces is that demons can mimic all the charismatic graces. They can actually give people a form of gift of tongues. And they can also move our emotions and things like that and give us impressions. And so as a result, we'll actually have people who think that they're experiencing something and they think it's from God. Well, it's pleasant, it's good. So demons can actually make you feel loved. The worst case of possession I've ever had, the woman could not give up her attachment to the demon because he made her feel complete, she said. So this doesn't, they can make you feel any way that you can have any kind of emotions or feelings. They give you all sorts of impressions. They can even cause magical visions where you actually think you see stuff. This is one of the reasons why, even in case of possession, especially when we get towards the end of stage 5, which I'll talk a little bit about later, the demons can actually mimic visions. So a lot of times people have authentic visions of saints or Lord or Lady, what have you, but you have to tell them to ignore it because you don't know ultimately the source. Which always makes me nervous when people come up to me. I've had this happen to me a few times at watch, but I've seen a Lord or Lady. I'm like, you tell. Okay. Which, by the way, doesn't mean that some people haven't. I'm just saying. So, with oppression and relationship, so these people in Memphis think I have this gift of healing, which I don't. So they brought me this guy that had 4th stage pancreatic cancer. And they said, would you pray for him? I said, yeah, but I don't have any gift of healing. I said, but I'll do some minor exorcisms over him. And that's what I did. I did the minor exorcism of Leo XIII over him. And then a week later, he was cancer-free. A year later, he came, he had some other weird illness, so I did it again. And then that cleared up. At that point, I said, if you're being cursed or you're under a curse, you need to get that addressed. So they found out that curse is and address it, because that's why this stuff keeps reoccurring. But they can actually affect people's health, and gravely so, right? And one of the signs is, again, if you'll take medicines or do certain things, and it doesn't seem to be improving a lot. they can actually affect, because they can affect people's perceptions. Remember, they put an image and imagination with the cogitative powers, that ability to make associations. Disassociations, they can put perspective in relationship to your spouse or what have you. And so because they can do that, they can actually affect the perceptions that your boss has of you, and that's why you're fired. Sometimes they can affect your perceptions of the spouses of each other. That's one of the reasons why I tell spouses, I'll ask you, do you believe that your husband or your wife is a person of goodwill? Yes, I do. Then why are you looking at her from that point of view? You've got to get your head clear first before you honestly or truly going to get trying to talk to them. Because a lot of times, demons, the first thing they do is in dividing people is affect their perceptions so that people psychologically separate from each other. That's the first thing they always do in every relationship. So that's how they try and drive the wedge, by affecting their perceptions. So, and this is something that you have to just keep in mind. Sometimes people, too, as I mentioned, they can cause a lot of damage or cause accidents and things of this sort. Once in a while, when you get people, I had this one time, this woman said to me, she said, do you think, she said, well, I totaled 2 cars out this weekend. I think it's diabolic, and I wanted to tell her, she didn't have bad driving record. So sometimes you have to first look for the natural reason, but then sometimes it is, and what you're looking for with oppressions patterns. The same thing keeps happening over and over again. Another common one that we see is men who are perfectly hireable, they've got a great resume, they're totally capable of working, they've had a good work history, and they cannot secure a job. We'll do some probes over them, they'll break the oppression, we'll do certain things to break the oppression, and then all of a sudden, boom, within a month they're hired. So this is something that you can actually, even part of the health issues too, they can actually block women from becoming pregnant. So one of the exorcists that trained me actually had a case of this woman who went 9 years without having any children. He did a minor exorcism over her, she was pregnant within a month. So I'm not suggesting that, having problems getting pregnant is necessarily connected to diabolical. That's the things that they can actually do. So how do you address oppression? There's essentially 2 ways. Now, historically, exorcists always said that the way you break oppression is that you just increase your prayer life and it'll slowly taper off. This is one of the reasons why we really encourage in this protocol, which I and this lady who works for me developed. And basically the protocol is essentially 4 things. The first is getting up at St. Angeles at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6, and doing that every single day. People always try to negotiate that. Well, can't you get up at 7? No, that's exactly why I'm getting you out of bed at 6, because you need discipline. The second point, and the second part is doing the first, what's called the auxiliary Christian order. You can go right on the internet and say they're not very long, they take 5 to 7 minutes a day. And when you're saying those prayers, if you just start saying them, you'll automatically become a member. And those prayers provide a level of protection for you and for your family. Currently, we think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000 people worldwide saying this. So as soon as you do that, you're actually plugging into the 250,000 people praying for you and your family and praying for theirs, of course. But you're plugging into stuff that's very substantial. We've had cases of severe depression and even obsession just get blown out just within a week of people saying those prayers. So there's that. Then the third thing is what we call media fasting. You gotta unplug from all the garbage that's being put in your hand by all the news media and all the stuff on the internet and just cut it down. People say that alone a lot of times can clear out your depression and even diabolical obsession. And then the last one, of course, is just making sure you stay out of mortal sin and receive the sacraments. Okay, so that's basically the easy way, or that's the way that you can actually address diabolical oppression in your real life without having to see a priest or even an exorcist. However, because there had never been any exorcist that had said this is a silver bullet in relationship to diabolical oppression, I had this case of possession, and at one point the demon said, you're not going to break the possession until you break the obsession. So then I said, okay, we're just going to beat it out of him. And it was 3 of the most brutal days of session I've ever had with any demon, any level whatsoever. He did not want to give this information. But at a certain point, he finally had to give it up, and he said, look, it's like any other right. I'm like, yeah, so. He just looks at me like I'm an idiot, okay? I'm an idiot, humor me, right? Tell him what it is. So he says, you have rights over your property, and you have to reassert your rights over these things or over your externals and command us to leave, and we'll leave. Now, we naturally do this as human beings. Well, let's say for the sake of argument that I had a set of nodes sitting out on my front lawn, right? And I particularly fond of these nodes. I'm sitting out on my porch and some guy comes up and starts hauling my nodes off, right? What's our first, the natural law, what we do, the first thing we do is, hey, those are my nodes. So we assert our rights over the thing, and then we tell them, get off our property, right? So that's exactly what we do with demons, right? So we drafted a prayer, and it worked. We started doing saying the prayer, and it would stop. Then we would go to something else, and we do it for that, and it would stop. And it turned into one of these games of wobble, right? I could do this. And I got tired of that, so in one of the sessions, I just said, I'm sick of this. So I said, how do we get that to stop? And he said, this is how it works. As long as you retain the rights over your property, Christ will always allow us a certain amount of access to them. But if you consecrate them to Our Lady and give them entirely to her, it doesn't mean you're not the custodian of those things and continue using them, etc. He says if you consecrate to them and give them entirely to her, once she accepts it, we are forbidden to touch it. We have found that consecrating those externals shuts off 90 to 95% of diabolical oppression, almost overnight. And so this is something that's really important. You have to keep doing it from time to time. And it has to be truly detachment. You have to be letting loose of this thing and giving it to Our Lady. The next form of diabolic influence is diabolic obsession. This is basically where they attack the person psychologically, but in a much more intense way than normal temptation. So they'll put things in the person's mind, and their force of putting it in the mind is so strong that the person can't think outside the box, and you can't get clarity about the subject. And then the demons do this thing called running commentary. So each time the person tries to look at it from a different point of view or try to get it out, they just add some other aspect of the commentary. And so as a result, the person has a hard time thinking outside the box. Some of it described as kind of like tunnel vision. And then they also can move the emotions to where the person, so they have this in their mind, and then the emotions become really strong in relationship to this, and so their judgment is bound, and they can't think clearly. So this, one of the signs of diabolical oppression, or obsession, is the person will just get up in the morning and all of a sudden they're just angry at us with why angry. I don't know, because it's not set off by any external stimulus, which is what psychological obsession is. In fact, the way you can discern psychological obsession from diabolic obsession is diabolic obsession will just switch on and then just switch off without any real rhyme or reason as to why it was there. The person, during their period of lucidity, and then they go into this period of crisis where they're being attacked, and they can't think clearly, then they come out the other end, they're like, I don't know, why was he thinking that? Right? And so it just switches on and it just switches off without necessarily any external stimulus. It can also cause the person to have these emotions without anything in their imagination. You see, what moves our emotions is the perspective that we have on the image in our imagination. I mentioned that last night. The guy, when he's first married, he looks at his wife, and the perspective he has on his delight. And after 10 years of marriage, she thinks of suffering. Right? Okay. And that's just because of the perspective, and that's why he has different emotion movements. So I tell guys, look, if you don't want to deal with that, you got to change how you view your wife, and wives with your husbands, etc. So the point being is that it's psychological obsession. It's a set of mental habits a person's gotten into that, and you can usually track it to some type of event or series of events that cause the person to begin obsessing. And so there's a slow decline, and it's very consistent. When you take people who are diabolically obsessed and you pray over them, all of a sudden, boom, it lifts, and all of a sudden they feel symptom-free. And how heavy the diabolic obsession is will determine how long they have that period of clarity. If it's like half a day, that means it's pretty severe. If it goes like a week, that means it's not so bad. And so the primary way that we have found with diabolic obsession to address it is through this protocol. The problem with people who are diabolically obsessed is in every case we've ever come across, it's because people are spiritually undisciplined. They're not praying on a consistent basis, or fasting on a consistent basis, or doing certain things on a consistent basis, which would build their spiritual strength and discipline. And so, of course, that's the first thing we do is put them on a plan of discipline, forcing them to do these things. And once they start doing it, a lot of times that will just clear it out on its own. Doing meditation. Teresa of Avila says that there's, and going across talk about how there's 9 levels of prayer. First level is vocal prayer. The second one is meditation, mental prayer. The next one after that is effective prayer, recurrence, simplicity, compassion. It goes up, right? And so these 9 levels of prayer, most Catholics never even get beyond the first or second level. And she said the entry to all the higher levels of mental prayer, or all the higher levels of mystical contemplation, you have to go through meditation, and most people never begin there. But if people are meditating, then a lot of times that itself will blow out the diabolic obsession. Why? Because in meditating, you're actually thinking, you're using your imagination to think of things that are holy, that are of God, etc. And so when the demons deal with that, by trying to force your imagination, you're thinking of something that's holy, they're going to back off. And so meditation itself, doing it every single day for a minimum of 15 minutes a day, itself will keep diabolic obsession at bay, and it will also blow it out, generally speaking. Okay. Diabolic obsession is increasing, however. We've noticed that there's quite a bit of an uptick of diabolic obsession. Somebody asked me what percentage of adult people in the United States are diabolically obsessed. And I said, based on my experience, I would probably say it's somewhere in the area of 25%. Later, I asked several other exorcists, and they said basically the same thing. And part of the reason we're seeing that is because A, people are getting good Catholic lives and committing moral sin, which is kind of how demons get their foot in the door. But then also, one of the things is that they're doing things that can open up the door to this. Because any mortal sin can open up here due to diabolic obsession. The most common one we're seeing is people who are fully doing pornography. In fact, most people are unaware of the fact that the Satanists taught the people in the pornography industry that if you curse the master copy of the pornography, all the subsequent copies bear the same curse, and whoever watches it may become subject to that curse. We've seen guys become possessed through this process. And so the point being is that we're seeing a drastic increase in diabolic obsession. They used to say, before the Second Vatican Council, that the Catholics had the least amount of mental illness of all denominations. And all the psychologists admit it was because of the outlet of confession. After the Second Vatican Council, there's more Catholics in mental institutions than any other denomination. Getting to confession on a regular basis, in fact, confession, remember when I said I can pray with people and all of a sudden it lifts? Going to confession has the same effect. People will go to confession and all of a sudden, this, and they feel something free. You see this most of the relationship with the Sixth Commandment. You see guys who struggle with chastity, right? And then they fall, and then they come to confession. They get absolution, and all of a sudden they feel something free for a little while, and then they kind of set back in again and go through this pattern like this. And that's a pretty clear sign that it's diabolic obsession. So this is something that people really need to work on and do meditation if no other reason than to start to scale the heights of perfection, because you can't do it without meditation. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas says it's impossible to eradicate venial sin from your life and even imperfections without meditation. This is why a lot of Catholics that are leading decent lives are to the point where they're pretty much staying out of mortal sin, but they never fully conquer venial sin. Then the next is possession. And there's 2 kinds of possession, partial and full. Partial possession is when the demons possess part of the body. Full possession is when they have the whole of the body. They sometimes also make the distinction between partial and full, when the person that's partially possessed will go through periods of lucidity, where they're totally fine, they're functioning, they're normal, the demons are leaving them alone, and then they go through this period of crisis where the demons are attacking them, they might be manifesting through them, they might be doing certain things in order to take the person down and afflict the person. And then they'll go, and they'll kind of switch off again, so it has somewhat similarity to diabolic obsession. But they go through these periods of clarity. How long that period of clarity is determines how bad the possession is. So if it's a pretty long time, then it's probably not so bad. Whereas if there's hardly any periods of clarity, that's a really dangerous sign, because it's a sign that the demons have done this thing called enmeshment, but it's this building, which I talked about last night. They build psychological compatibility with the person that they possess. So once they possess, they start picking at the person with very specific things and getting deep into the person's psychology. And as the person gets into that, it empowers the demons and they become more subject to them. And so, as time goes on, they get so enmeshed in their psychology, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to get them out. In fact, there's one kind of possession that I tell exorcists, you'll never liberate them. And it's when a person has borderline personality disorder, possessions layered on top of it. Borderline personality disorder people, I call them justice collectors. It doesn't matter what you do, you say good morning, and they're like, what do you mean by that? There's nothing you can do. And I'm just chewing you out for it, right? And so we're constantly looking at these injustices to get over on top of you because it gives you a form of sense of empowerment. The problem is when you layer possession on top of that, you can't say the prayers for the person because the demons are driving. They've started driving this borderline personality disorder, driving that, and so you can't get them psychologically disentangled in order to get the person to fight the thing properly. Then at the same time, they can't go to a psychologist because the demon's doing this running commentary, so that everything the psychologist says is see, she doesn't believe you, see, she thinks you're nutty, see this, and so the person literally can't get clarity in those moments. But that brings up a very important point. People say, well, what's the connection between things that are psychological and possession? How can you tell the difference? And actually, if you really know human psychology really well, and you've done a lot of exercises, you've seen a lot of diabolic behavior, because demons themselves have a very distinctive psychology. It's very similar to ours in certain respects, and it's very different from ours in a lot of respects. And so when you can actually just talk to somebody, and a lot of times you know this is diabolic psychological patterns. These are not human patterns. I'll give you an example. There's a case of this woman who was possessed, and the answer is that they thought she was possessed. And so the bishop of the area asked me to take a look at it. I did the diagnostic, and I said, yes, it's possession. And the possession includes what we call a guardian spirit. That's where there's demons that are possessing the person, but then Satan assigns a guardian to the possession to keep angels and things away and other people that might get the person help. And I said, those kinds of cases drag out. And I just don't have time to do it because I'm working on all my other things. So I trained an exorcist for his diocese. He started the process. And I was visiting again at a certain point. He said, would you sit in? Okay, so I'm sitting, and we go into the room where the woman is sitting there. And the exorcist starts talking to the woman. And she's just like, I don't want to do this. It's so painful. Why do we have to keep doing this? Why can't we just do it tomorrow? And so there's this evasion that's starting to go on. And because the exorcist is much taller than I am, which isn't too difficult, but he's much taller than I am, I just stood behind him. The bishop had given me faculties for the case, so I started what's called chapter 2, which is the solemn exorcism of the old rite. I just stood behind him, and I started saying it so voces that she couldn't hear me. And all of a sudden, he immediately manifested. And then, after the session, the husband comes up to me, because he had been dealing with this for years. And he said, you need to tell me, all these years, I haven't even been talking to my wife. I said, probably. This is that their patterns, they can mimic psychological patterns of human beings, but they have very distinctive psychological patterns. And these patterns we call, they're part of what we call the secondary signs. So, for example, mendacity, I mentioned some of them, malice. There's a whole series of them that we have that you can just start looking at, and once you see it, realize there's the secondary signs, possession. But there's some people where the psychological patterns or the behavior that you'll see the person engaging in, the person's problems during the periods of clarity, they're totally normal, rational, fine, they can function perfectly fine. And so the problems that you see when the demon's manifesting is entirely diabolic, and there's no psychological aspect to it whatsoever. Then there's people whose problems are entirely psychological or psychiatric. So one time this mother brought me with her son, and she said, he's possessed. I said, well, why do you think he's possessed? Well, because he's hearing voices, which, by the way, you can hear voices with a variety of reasons. Especially one of them. There can be a whole different variety of reasons for it. And actually hearing voices, you can there's a level of diabolical pressure that's so high that the demons start talking to people even though they don't possess them. And so I turned around and I just said, to hearing voices, what do they sound like? George Bush and Ronald Reagan. Okay. What are they telling you to vote Republican? I'm like, this is one of the few times I'm like, do I tell them to follow those voices? So I told the mother, I said, I want his entire medical history. So they sent it to me. As it turns out that he had drug-induced psychosis. He was smoking marijuana, and as a result of that caused the psychosis. He was hearing voices. So the problem is entirely, people's problems are entirely psychological and don't have anything to do with the dialogue. Now, once in a while, we have a phrase, it's called LDBD, Little Demon Big Trauma. And basically what that is people who, the demon just has to, and all of a sudden, boom, the person just blows up. And these are the people that the demon's, the person's psychological compatibility with the demon is so strong that the demon doesn't have to do hardly any work. In fact, a lot of times he doesn't even bother possessing them, because why bother with all that energy when you can just get what you want anyway. Okay. So whenever we see people with a lot of drama, we have to kind of start sorting this, sorting it out, because usually there's a heavy psychological component. But as I mentioned, the demons start picking at people, and so there's this enmeshment that begins to occur. And so about 80% of the cases, there's some degree of psychological compatibility or psychological issues that people have, in addition to things that are possessed, in addition to possession. The principal way that we would ultimately discern whether it's psychological or not is from what we call the preternatural signs. Now, the church says there are 3 preternatural signs. And by preternatural, we mean these are things that are above and beyond what any human being is capable of doing. And the first is speaking languages that the person's never studied or never heard or learned. So the first case of possession I had, when the demon manifested, he started speaking, it sounded quasi-Aramaic. We didn't quite know what it was, so we wrote it down phonetically. We took it to a philologist, and he looked at it and says, yeah, well, that's what we think that the Phoenician was spoken 3,500 years ago sounded like. This guy never finished high school. So a lot of times, too, though, the demon's God restricts them in which languages that they can actually speak with the exorcist. So I had one case where the demon was, he could only be permitted only to speak in Latin, which was kind of funny because he was pretty snooty about it, too. So if I would use the accusative case, when I should have used the allative, the declension in my grammar, he would act like he didn't have to pay attention to me. So then I would change it, and then he would obey. I'm like, he would say something like that now. So, but this is someone who never even studied Latin. And the case I'm working on right now, I beat out the demon, what was the nature of this ritual? And she spoke a phrase in Russian, and she's never even studied Russian. So, and then we found out it was this specific and very precise phrase in relationship to a Russian ritual that had been done over 1,000 years ago to keep paganism and witchcraft in Russia, which is what actually Christianity was pagan witchcraft. They have been paralleling with that ever since. It's part of their culture. Okay. So this speaking languages that they've never heard. So this means, though, that it's a coherent language, but the person doesn't understand it. The difference between that and an authentic gift of tongues, there's 2 forms of authentic gift of tongues. The first is where a person speaks their language, and then other people hear theirs. We saw this with St. Peter. After Pentecost, he goes out, he speaks, and then all these other people hear their own languages as he's speaking his language. Then there's Philip. So Philip approaches the eunuch, and he's given the infused knowledge of the eunuch's language, and so he actually can then converse with him in that language. So the person actually has a coherent language, and the speaker knows what they're saying. Whereas with when it's diabolic, the person who's possessed often does not know what's being said, but the language is coherent, and so you actually know that the demon is actually communicating with you. Okay, so that's the first. The second one is occult knowledge, and this is it's occult in the sense that there's no way this person can actually know this information. So, for example, all of a sudden they'll start talking about something that actually happened that day, and there's no way this person could know. So, for example, one time a bishop actually decided to sit in on a session, and at a certain point during the session, the demon manifested, starts going, and then finally looks over the bishop and recounted a venial sin he had committed that morning. Now, there's no way this person would have known that kind of specific information. But to the bishop's credit, the demon looked at it and said, your problem is, though, is you always repent as soon as you see it. So I think he's one of the few holy bishops out there. Okay. Then, so they have specifics, knowledge of things, there's no way they could know this information. And this is things that can happen at a distance, other particulars that there's no way they can know people's history. They can reveal crimes that people have committed. And that's actually what happened in the case of Annalise Michel, who is the person that the movie Emily Rose is based on. One of the reasons that she was an extraordinarily saintly woman, I'm not going to go into all of that, but she was an extraordinary. During her periods of lucidity, she would spend hours in front of the Blessed Sacrament praying for the clergy in Germany at the time, because this was in the early 70s and they're going completely off the rails. Even, I like what we're seeing today. And what happened is during the session, the reason the bishops won't allow the canonization process to go forward is because if they do that, all the archives have to be opened up. And one of the things that the demons were doing was they were naming names of all who the evil bishops and cardinals and priests were in Germany. And so they're just like, yeah, I'm not going down that path. Okay. So the point being is that this is stuff, and the demons were naming the precise things that these guys were doing. And so this is stuff that there's no way that they could actually know. The second form of occult knowledge is demons will talk in a way they speak in philosophical or theological language in such a way that there's no way this person could know those kinds of discussions and distinctions. I tell people, look, every demon is Catholic. Every demon. There's no Protestant demons. How do we know? Very simple. Every single demon that I've ever dealt with, and every other exorcist has ever dealt with, it's always some point of Catholic theology that they refuse to accept. You never hear a demon say, oh, well, as soon as I heard that I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, then I'm going to say, I just didn't accept that. They never talk that way. In fact, as the ritual says, they're the doctor of heresy. They're the doctors of heresy. They're the ones that come up with this nonsense. Right? Okay. So, the point being is that the person will say certain things, make certain theological distinctions, you're just like, there's no way they could say this, there's no way they could know. So, in one case that I have, the demon made a distinction in Latin between what he said, because I was dragging this guy through every single sorrow of Our Lady, because when he was created, he was given a vision of her interior life that she's going to have in this life. And he said when he saw that, he said she was so absolutely beautiful that he couldn't bring himself to share her even with God. And so, and that what he was seeing was her interior life as she had gone through all of her sorrows. And so at a certain point, I commanded him to tell me and what was going through Our Lady during her sixth sorrow. That's when they take Christ down from the cross, and she's holding Christ. And he said, "Consummate rest." Okay, I'll explain what that means here in a minute. Then he said, "What about the seventh sorrow? They need to rest." I'm probably only one of 5 theologians on this planet that even knows that distinction in Latin. And it basically boils down to this. And it's only because I had stumbled across it in a book that I had read years ago. In a sacrifice, there's 3 components. The first is you have to offer the thing to God. This comes straight out of the Old Testament. You have to offer the thing to God, which sets it aside for sacred use. The second thing is you have to slay the victim. So the offertory relationship to Christ was in the garden, and he said, "Not thy will, but thine be done." Then he's slaying the victim, so he has to go through the passion. The consummate rest means it's complete. So that's why what happens is in the sufferings of Christ, the reason Christ went through that totally brutal process of the passion was to merit everything that was necessary to undo all the effects of original sin, all our woundedness, and everything that was necessary to completely restore humanity to perfection. Each and everything he did undid the fall of Adam and Eve. And that's why he went through all that. And it's not until they give him the myrrh, which is the inversion of eating fruit, right? Or they give him the vinegar, that his response is consummateness. It's complete. Because why? It's in the eating of the fruit that their disobedience becomes complete. And in his, it was that where it becomes complete. That's why it says consummateness, and then he dies immediately after that. In relationship to Our Lady, the consummateness it wasn't until she had to hold the dead body of our Lord that her sacrifice that she went through was complete. But in the Mass, the offertory is done at a certain point of the Mass, and then the splitting of the species during the consecration is the slaying of the victim, and then the consuming of the host by the priest is the consummation of the Mass. That's why they used to ring the bell at the offertory, and you had to come running in to fulfill your Sunday obligation. As soon as a priest received communion in some Latin American countries, they ring the bell again and it would pile out, right? Well, I fulfill my obligation. It's usually the guy sitting outside smoking, listening for the bell. Okay. But even after the priest receives full communion, it's not finished yet. The ritual isn't finished. And so he said, when Our Lady finally put Christ in the tomb, everything she had gone through is finally finished. Right? It's done. Everything that she was told by Saint Simeon, the whole process of the Passion, she knew most of the details before it ever even happened. And these details, when she got into the Christ buried, she knows it's finally finished. That distinction between consolatum est and finitum est is, I mentioned, some that very, very few people would have known at the time when she said this. And yet this demon just talked about that like it was nothing to him. Okay, so that's a sign of occult knowledge. And this woman barely finished high school. Okay. Then, the other form of, the other thing that we do a diagnosis of possession is, and this is called the complexion of the spiritual battle. Obviously, these are the more intense forms of the spiritual battle that I and exorcists and other people deal with. But this gives you a sense of the battlefield. And most people aren't going to be dealing with this stuff, but you should be aware of it. But also know that the temptations can actually lead to oppression, can lead to obsession, which then can lead to possession. So you have to try and work on working people up the scale, so to speak. The last one is things that are beyond human capacity. So this would include things like superhuman strength. The most common one is what we call morphing. It's where people change shape. So one of the exorcists that trained me, every time we would put the skull on the back of the guy who was possessed head, his face would elongate, it would look like a wolf. There are times in which, for example, women will completely transform into the figure of a man because they're manifesting what the demons actually look like, the characteristics of the demons. So, in fact, that's 95% of what the exorcist sees is morphing by varying degrees. When people say, isn't that kind of scary? I'm like, nah, after a while, it's just part of the landscape. Right? In fact, the only thing the reason I pay attention to any of it is because I'm trying to figure out what can I learn from that. Is every time, and this is something that's really important, when people are really holy, they have a lot of virtue. So their faculties are trained to perceive things that are evil, but also be inclined to things that are virtuous. So when the demons come to tempt them, the person's much more sensitive and more likely to turn the demons. That's why they don't like to attack people who are holy. It's the same thing with the trained exorcist. After he's been doing it for a while, they don't want to attack him because as soon as they do that, it's based on the principle the cause is always some way the effect. And what that means is that every time a demon attacks you, he reveals something about himself in that process. It's not like you welcome the attacks, but when they happen after I've dealt with them, I'll stand back and say, what did I just see? What am I looking at? And a lot of times you'll see something that gives you a complexion, and then you can go into the next session and you can hammer it with that very thing because he's revealing something about his personality in that process. Okay. So, that morphing can give you a sense of who and what they actually are. Now, some demons, like for example Lucifer, every time I've had him in a case, he manifests differently. Whereas Beelzebub, which is another name for Satan, so Lucifer, Satan, Beelzebub are the same guy, but then Beelzebub manifests in the context of Beelzebub, he always manifests in the exact same way. His jaw elongates a little bit, head becomes narrow, and eyes become bloodshot. And so this is something you see consistently. And so sometimes you'll see it like, oh, there he is again, right? But it's one of those things that, again, people think that, being an exorcist must be really interesting. Actually, it's extraordinarily mundane. Because, 95 to 99% of what you're doing is just praying for this guy, beating him silly and making his life miserable. My job is basically to torture rational creatures to the point where the pain is so severe that they give me information, right? And after a while, you're just, it takes a bit of doing to keep your focus because it's just the same stuff over and over again. The demons are the same, do the same stuff over and over again. So after a while, it gets a little boring. The only really interesting thing is not the demons at all. The only real interesting thing is, as I mentioned last night, that being an exorcist is like being on the receiving end of a sewer pipe, right? But women lose their rings down the drain once in a while, so you get these little gems floating down, right, from time to time. And so, like, for example, when the demon said that Our Lady's interior life was so absolutely beautiful, he later revealed why that is. If you want to hear it, actually I did a conference called Our Lady of Fair Love. That in there I talk about why she was so beautiful interiorly, even though they say physically she was very beautiful. That's her interior life. The demons were completely taken with when they first saw her, or it was revealed to them. But it's things like that that give you pause to realize how beautiful the other side of things are. The diabolical stuff is, like I said, after a while it gets boring. It's this other stuff that just will blow your mind. And so once in a while, like we just had this last week, where this one demon revealed something about the nature of sacrifice that it literally left all the priests that were there stunned for a day and a half. This is it revealed something about the nature of sacrifice and how unfortunately nobody sacrifices anymore, and that's why most people end up spiritually lazy and don't like doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's why a lot of priests are very lazy, even as priests, etc. But it's things like that that are beautiful. Another thing that we will see from time to time is levitation. And levitation is not necessarily a sign of possession. Because St. John Chrysostom, I think that used to levitate, and that was from a spirit, a supernatural cause. God caused it to levitate when we pray or say mass. So sometimes too, you can go to certain houses and people can be levitating against something in the house, which is very, very rare, but you can see that. So levitation is not a necessary sign, but it's one of the things that you actually see. And so this category is anything that is beyond any kind of human capacity. You know, so for example, one time I was listening to a psychologist, and they're just like, you know, maybe the person's just watched a few too many movies, or maybe they're just, this is a psychological problem. I'm like, I don't think sticking to the ceiling is a psychological problem. So, and this is one of the things that, you know, sometimes you scratch your head with these modern psychologists, and you're just like, really? You know? Or people will say, they'll say things like, well, you know, maybe they learned the language, like how they learned the language. Well, maybe they heard it once. Do you know of anybody that can hear a part of the language once and then be absolutely fluent in the thing? It just doesn't even make any sense. It violates what we call the principle of sufficient reason, which makes no sense. But anyway, so those are the preternatural signs. And before you proceed to solemn exorcism, you have to make sure that you see at least one of those. I mean, not necessarily all of them. Even though the demons are capable of doing it, God restricts them. But the primary case I'm working on right now, it's this whole knowledge that he's constantly talking about and revealing. And so this is how we know that the person's possessed. Okay. The possession, then, is, people say, well, how can you actually become possessed? There's essentially three ways that you can become possessed, but they all hinge on God's will. Nobody becomes possessed unless God permits it. Okay. So the first is you commit a mortal sin. As I mentioned last night, any mortal sin is an open door to possession. Any mortal sin. We've had cases where a woman, when she was 17, committed a mortal sin of pride that caused her to be possessed. Fornication, as I mentioned, pornography, any mortal sin. The more common ones are things like witchcraft, being involved in Satanism, or dabbling in that, those kinds of things, etc. And so it's something, some mortal sin that the person does, and so at a certain point God will allow the demons into the life so that the person is as a form of correction. You know, it's like a parent spanking the kid in order because you're not doing the right thing. Okay? The difficulty a lot of times that does happen is people don't take a spiritual approach to it, so once the demon gets into the person's life, then he starts driving really bad behaviors, and the person gets even worse. But a lot of times people then don't realize, oh, this is bad, I gotta do something. The next is through no fault of their own. Now, sometimes you hear exorcists, you can't become possessed unless you give into it. That's just completely false. Unless you consent. That's just completely false. It's right in Scripture that we know that's not true. Christ asked the father of the demoniac, how long has he been like this? Since birth. You can become, there's cases where exorcists recount where people have become possessed in the womb. And I've had cases where people were possessed, in fact, a lot of cases, especially involving women who've been molested or raped or things like that, is because it's before the even age of reason. And so the demon gets their foot in the door very early on, and then they just live with the person and drive the person throughout the course of their life. And so so the second one is anything that bad, gravely disordered happens to the individual. You have to remember, the domain of Satan is disorder. So any grave disorder is an open door to possession. One woman I know became possessed by Baal, a pretty stout guy. He's a hard demon to get out. He's a very strong one of the top demons. And he got in because her sister ran her over with a car. So you can get, and like I said, a lot of times, for example, you'll find when women come to you, you find out that they're possessed, and then you ask them, because one of the things is that one of the ways you can do a diagnostic is part of a diagnostic. It doesn't tell you for certain, but you ask, is there a part of your body that you've never injured for which you have chronic problems? And that's an indicator that that's the part of the body that the demon's possessing. And if a woman's been raped, or I should say, if she says, yeah, I've always had back problems, but I've never injured it, I'll just ask you a simple question. Do you feel like sometimes like there's a knife on the front end? And almost always will say yes, even though they've been raped. So there's certain things that you'll see correspond. Sometimes it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Right? I'm possessing that part. But the point being is that it can be through no fault of their own. And then once the demon gets in, he starts driving things and getting them to try to commit moral sin, etc. But sometimes demons can get in and people can go almost their entire life leading good Catholic lives and just have other issues, and the demon's kind of still working on things in the background. Okay. The other part, that would also include like being cursed, someone can curse you, etc. And that's not too common, but we're starting to see again more of that because of the rise of witchcraft and Satanism. It's becoming more and more common. We're seeing that more in relationship to oppression, as I mentioned. We're seeing that more there than in possession. Though we do see it from time to time, people who have been cursed, and that's why they're possessed. The third is purely by the will of God alone. So let's go back to Emily Rose. So Emily Rose was actually possessed twice. The movie didn't get it right. The movie's based on a book. It's very accurate to the book, but the book isn't accurate. So, in point in fact, she never went off her meds. Right? So they say, oh, it was because no, actually, the reason that the priest was actually prosecuted, although they did give him time served, that part's accurate, was because of the fact that the demons were blocking her from being able to eat, and they thought they should have gotten her to the hospital sooner. That's the only reason he spent time in jail. But the first possession was caused because one of the women in her town cursed her. The second time, after that, then she was liberated. And then it was about 3 months later, Our Lady appeared to her and said, would you be willing to allow the possession again so that many would come to knowledge of these things, of the spiritual realities? And she said yes. And so she offered that, the pain and suffering she was going through an exorcism process that was extraordinarily painful. And she offered that up for the clergy at the time, because as I mentioned, they were going completely off the rails. When people come to me, their problems are truly psychologically, but they want it to be possession, so I used to wait my home and they get their, I call it the McDonald's approach, drive up, get their Big Mac, and go home. They think, well, the problems are psychological. If the priest just pictured me, then it'll be gone. Okay. Going through an exorcism process is far more brutal and painful than just seeing a psychologist and looking at the problems. And this is something that people have to kind of keep in mind. There's 6 stages of liberation in relation to possession. The first is, so when somebody comes to me, it goes through, it can skip certain stages, sometimes it's very contracted, it doesn't go through all 6 stages, sometimes it goes through parts of the stages, etc. And each of the stages are also broken down into some sections. But we're not going to get into all that. Okay. The first part is the discovery phase. And this is when you think, there's probably something diabolic or something beyond human. It's beyond something that's natural. So one of the cases of possession I had, the woman was doing yoga in her room, and the husband comes in and says, I don't know if I'd like you doing yoga. And all of a sudden, the lights in the house dim. She gets the Terminator eyes, and they come out, and out of her mouth comes, that's for you, in a male voice. And all of a sudden, lights come on. Okay, we've discovered something. So this is usually it's not quite that dramatic. Usually you'll see a lot of the secondary signs of possession that are accompanying it, and so you start putting people on this protocol, which, as I mentioned before, we start putting on that starts clearing out a lot of this stuff. But the protocol is something that's very helpful. So then we discover, we start praying with the person, we start to see more of the secondary signs. And then they go through the second phase, which is called the obfuscation phase. This is where the demon tries to convince the person that, there's no demon here, you're just nutty, you just need to see another doctor, you need this medication, or maybe you need to go see another doctor. And so a lot of times people come to us and they've met every psychologist and every psychiatrist and every medical doctor in the area, and they're just like, we can't help you. Right? And so a lot of times they'll have gone through all of that. So that's the obfuscation phase. But then as you're praying with the person, what will happen is you get to the point where you pray over them, and then the demon manifests in a prayer natural way. By prayer natural, I mean it doesn't look just malevolent. Right? Because bad behavior can be a result of people's choices. We're talking, as I mentioned, levitation, a person changing shape, or him saying things, or speaking a language they don't know, etc. It's at that point that you enter into stage 3, which is called the battle phase. This constitutes a bulk of the exorcisms that you're going to do. And the battle phase is essentially to gain the following information. That it's right in the ritual. You want to find out how many demons there are, what their names are, because the names can tell you an awful lot. If you get the names at the very beginning of the possession process, liberation process, it means it doesn't really mean a whole lot, but they can give you some information. If they hold out, don't leave your name until at the end, it's usually a sign of departure. That means that's when they're going to leave. Or they're going to leave shortly after that. So you get you want to find out what their names are. So, and this is basically to make sure that you understand what's going on, and so that you can get rid of the demons, make sure that you've cleaned all the house up, there's not some guy lingering around. And there's always some demon that's more talkative and blabs a lot, and you just isolate it from the other demons and beat it until he tells you everything. Okay. Then the third is, so the number of demons, what their names are, how did you get in? Because a lot of times, how they got in is the inversion of how you're going to get them out. So if it was by a pact of the devil, or if it was by some type of curse, then you just do stuff to break the curse, and then a lot of times you can get the demons out. The second is, the fourth thing is time and date of departure. It's in the ritual. I usually don't ask that and press it too much with demons because I find that they lie almost all the time. Father Amorth, who was probably the father of modern exorcism in Rome, did it for 40 years or more, I think. But anyway, he talks about, he didn't pass that, and Belmonte, who's now the head of the International Association of Exorcists, I agree with him. He says, I don't ask it because they lie most of the time. And what happens is they'll say, oh, I'm leaving next week, and then the next week comes and then they don't leave, and then it discourages the person because you're spending your whole time trying to get this person to, first of all, get psychological separation from the demon in this process, as I mentioned, but then also to get them to build that confidence that God is going to liberate them. And it's very difficult because you're getting beat around a lot. And then the last piece of information, as you're going along in stage 3, you're going to do that. As I mentioned, what will happen is it's like throwing them, right at the beginning, they'll just blab all sorts of information, do all sorts of stuff. I just tell guys, keep a mental note of it. Because it's like I said, it's like throwing a puzzle up in the air and it lands, you don't even know what you're looking at. But these are the pieces. And as they start getting towards stage 5, into stage 5, all the pieces start to come together and you see this coherent picture of the spiritual reality that's behind the scene, and that's what explains the possession. But then the stage 3, your goal is then is what you're trying to get out, which you usually get in stage 5. But the thing you're trying to get out of that is what is it going to take to get you out? Now this brings up a very important point in relationship to spiritual warfare that we're going to there go to the Q&A. And that's this. Spiritual warfare is like any type of warfare. Precision is everything. You can pray until the cows come home over a person and not get anywhere. And all it takes is for him to tell you one little prayer the person has to say and boom, he's out. It's the same thing with oppression. So when you're consecrating your exterior goods, you're doing those things, you have to be as precise, mentioning the very things that they're attacking. It's the same thing. So precision is everything. And you'll find this. It's not until the picture coalesces, comes together, that they'll tell you something. And by the way, God is simple. When demons say, oh, she has to fast and drink water for a year, and then she's got to make these 3 pilgrimages, they're lying to you. Right? And because the reason they're lying to you is because they want to drag this thing out. It's always something simple, like she just has to say this prayer, or she has to go to this particular pilgrimage, or go on this particular pilgrimage and do this. Or sometimes it's just, you just have to close hands and tell them to leave. Or you have to say a specific prayer to St. Michael. It can be stuff that's very simple, but you won't necessarily know what that is until you get towards the end. Stage 4 is what we call the external phase. So if you're going through stage 3, you're gaining more and more power and authority over the demon. When it gets to the point where it gets to the end of stage 3, he starts losing control of the internal dynamics of the possession. He can't control things. The person's starting to gain psychological separation. And so then what happens is enter into stage 4, which is called the external phase. This is the stuff that you see in the movies where the person's levitating and starts moving around the room and all that kind of stuff. People say, have you seen that? I said, yeah, I've seen that. But it doesn't happen too often. Most people skip on that 4th stage. And it can be in a variety of different ways. So Hollywood always wants to make it dramatic. And like I said, it's pretty mundane most of the time. So then after you get towards the stage 4, then you enter, which is the external phase, you enter into stage 5, which is called the ascendancy phase. This is the phase where it starts to climb out, and the person's periods of lucidity get longer, the demons are leaving alone, they're starting to lead a pretty normal life, right? And it's getting like, this is a crucial stage because a lot of times, the only time they're experiencing any pain in relationship to demons is in sessions. So the demons say, look, if you just don't go to sessions, you're alone. Just don't lie. Because as soon as the person decides to make that going, the person just goes down for the camp, the demons get more power and control, and it's the process is much longer. But as they climb out, and then as I mentioned, what's going to happen is right when you get to the end of stage 5, he's going to tell you just one piece of information, and you just do that one thing, and then boom, it goes right. As I mentioned, God fashions that process to reveal these things about Him. There's a variety of several reasons why He allows possession: to help the family to grow in virtue, to help the person grow in virtue and purification, to teach the exorcist things. We learn an awful lot from different cases. It can be a whole variety of different reasons. Sometimes it's actually to get people to make reparation for something in the region. There was a case of a nun who was possessed in the 1930s in Iowa, and it became known that the reason the possession occurred was because of the fact that they were having divorce occurring in the region, and God was offended by it. And so he wanted reparation to be made, and as soon as they did reparation for 30 hours, they started at 40 hours, they didn't get quite to 40 hours, she was liberated. So a lot of times there's a whole variety of different reasons for this. The thing to always remember, as I mentioned, they're on a short leash all the time. So who can possess? What they can and cannot do in possession, how they can manifest, the time and how long the manifestation can happen, what they can do during the manifestation, what part of the body they possess, what languages they can speak, what they can say and what they can't say, because sometimes they know the answer, but they can't give it to you because God won't permit them because they have to obey Him. So that tells you how short of a leash that they're actually on, and that's the thing that gives us a lot of hope. God has absolute control over these guys, even though we suffer from them and we see this, He lets them get involved in our lives, but it's ultimately for our betterment. And so tomorrow we're going to talk about, how you're going to get this kind of under control. But the main thing is always having perfect confidence in God and in Our Lady. Because they can do it. Our Lady has perfect coercive power over demons. Perfect. Literally, when she shows up, it's over, or the dynamics of possession case drastically shift. The demons will literally, when you start to go, no, not her. And as soon as she shows up, boom, she doesn't have to say anything. People who have been liberated that I've worked with will have these visions. All of a sudden, Our Lady just shows up, they feel the demon getting ripped out, he goes down, the abyss opens up, he goes down, it closes, and just all the disappears. It's literally all that has to happen. In one case, she actually said to the demon, it's time, and poof, out he came. But otherwise, she just doesn't even have to say anything. That's why they fear her so much. Okay. We'll stop there and go to Q&A.
All right, thank you, Father. I'm going to start with a question to lead it off. So you've explained very beautifully and thoroughly what one might call sort of more the extraordinary aspects of Satan's activity. I wonder if you could just very briefly talk about the battlefield in the sense of really people's everyday lives and what kinds of things should we be aware of just in our day-to-day lives, in our families, our friends, our prayer life, just those kinds of battles that we might deal with.
Yeah, I think the two primary things is just remember that you're subject to temptation, and not that every temptation is from the devil, as I mentioned, some can be from the flesh of the world. But you can also, one of the things that's kind of very helpful is there's a conference I did called Disappropriation. This is that conference. It talks about how that if you're tempted, you can beat the demons up, and as I mentioned before, even if they didn't do it, they deserve a beating anyway. So, and that a lot of times can help push that. The things I mentioned is the perspectives. In families, they're constantly working on people's perspectives of each other, their perceptions of each other. And you have to be aware of that and keep that in mind. The other thing is they're constantly attacking people's vocations. And by that I mean they're constantly trying to disrupt various aspects of marriage. The fidelity, unity of the marriage, the exclusivity of the marriage, all that. They're constantly trying to attack those particular aspects of the marriage. They're also trying to, the goal is to get to the children, and so they'll attack those particular things within the family. I think a lot of times if people are just doing, which we'll talk about tomorrow, if they're doing some just basic things, they can keep a lot of that stuff at bay. I think a lot of it is just being aware of how this stuff works. The other part of it is too is that I mentioned it that you can't just ignore when the bullets are flying around. And so dealing with demons is one of those things where, when you see them, you address it if it needs to be addressed. Otherwise, you ignore them. In fact, exorcists is kind of humorous. Exorcists, demons are so self-absorbed. That during the session, sometimes exorcists will just stop and look away, and it just irritates the demons. Even when they're getting a beating, they better get the beating and have the attention, they can't ignore them. Right? It gives you that phrase, beat me, hit me, just don't ignore me. Right? But anyway, so this is one of those things. But just realize that when it arises, you address it in the way that's proportionate, the way that you actually address it, but then after that, you live your life. The thing that you want to remember, and this is something which is very helpful in relationship to dialogue and obsession, is, and you see this with scrupulosity. Scrupulosity is a distraction. It's getting people focused on anything but God. I just tell people, you keep your focus on God. You always keep your focus on God. And then when the demons pop up, you just do what you have to, and then you go back to focusing on God. Because if you focus on God, the demons aren't going to be sticking around for very long.
Father, do diabolicals enter an individual only to harm that individual or to recruit them to contaminate culture and other people in the environment?
All of the above, obviously. I mean, they do it for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes the demons, what they do is they're trying to commit false things, they're trying to get the door open so they can get into the person's life and then actually take them down. You have to remember that in hell, there's no grace, there's no love, they're not capable of loving each other, they can't stand each other. The only thing that's left is power. And so what they're trying to do is gain power over us so that if we end up in hell, they're above us and can have control and power over us. So that's part of the reason they're doing it. The other time, too, is that sometimes they don't have any choice. They're constricted. In fact, I'm dealing with the case right now with demons that I never wanted this. I never wanted to take possession. I never wanted any of this. And but God told him he had to do it, and there's a very specific reason why. And so he had to sit and take his beating, right? And so sometimes they're actually constricted by God in order to, so that good can actually come of it.
This kind of ties back to some of the stuff we talked about last night, but I was uncertain between the difference between imprecatory and deprecatory prayers of deliverance.
Yes.
And in particular, my youngest daughter is married in the church, but to kind of a marginal Catholic, I'll put it that way about it.
Right.
Can she say imprecatory prayers like the perimeter prayer in your book,
Right.
over herself and her kids? Can she say it over her husband without violating authority? And so on. I just wondered if you could clarify some of that.
I'm going to go into that tomorrow night as part of the way to remain protected. If you stay within the authority structure, you're actually remain protected. But I'll just give you the short answer, which then tomorrow we'll fill it out a bit. Husbands can do it over their wives and their children because all authority comes from God. So it comes either from the natural law or the divine positive law. Divine positive law is what we learn from Scripture and tradition. And that primarily pertains to the authority of the Pope, the bishops, the priests, because that's the structure that we have as far as the authority structure on the divine positive law side. And the natural law side primarily comes from the family. So the father has authority over the children and over his wife. The wife has authority over the children, but she doesn't have authority over her husband. But because of marriage, I'm going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow. Marriage, everyone's calling it a covenant, which it is. But a covenant is defined as a contract. So it's because of the fact that they've exchanged by rights. She has rights over his body, so she can command the demons to leave, so she can declare prayers there. The children can do it. The children can't do it with their parents in the relationship to intimatory prayers, which is the ability to command the demons to leave. They can't do that from the point of authority because of the fact that they don't have authority over their parents. However, we also notice that the ability to command demons to leave comes either from authority or from duty. So because of the obligations of the fourth commandment, siblings can command the demons to leave each other, and they can also command, you can also command them to leave yourself because you have authority over your body. But they can also do it in relationship to their parents because of the obligation of relationship to their parents. So they can use the imprecatory prayer that the command in form of binding prayers and women's prayers and things of that sort in relationship to their parents. This is a really important point because a lot of times people contact me and say, Father, my dad is dying and he won't say prayers. He just won't say it. I just tell him to start saying binding a person against any demon keeping them from receiving the sacraments. Demons can, through affecting people emotionally, block them from receiving the sacraments. We call it fishing, which is basically, you consider the confession, there's people outside, one's going to confession, you say a binding prayer against anybody who's keeping people from coming to confession, and within a minute, it's like clockwork. Some guy goes, Father, I was going to go to confession day 5, right? And so this gives you an idea. But it's very important, so this is to be something that can actually get the priest to the deathbed. Outside that context, you have to use what's declaratory prayers, and that's where instead of commanding the demons to be, you ask Christ or make yourself saint to drive the demons. So that's the short answer.
Father, do sacramentals help, like scapulars and
Yeah, that's one of it.
That's right.
So yeah, no, we're going to get into a lot of those and how they work. Different ones work in different ways.
Father, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about the Enneagram. Are you familiar with the Enneagram? And it's very controversial, and I just want to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's just controversial because people are ignorant of it. It's actually connected to the New Age movement. It's actually connected to Eastern mysticism. So I tell people to stay away from it. It's the same thing with yoga. I might as well just go on fast. There's a lot of people who do yoga. Right? I'm having, yeah, okay, here's the moral story. Let me ask you this. If someone said to me, because I'll tell them, well, you do realize that the positions and stretching motions in yoga are actual representation of Eastern deities who are demons. That's what it is. I'm just a messenger, don't feel the messenger. These are the experts in yoga, the top people worldwide say, this is the structure and nature of what yoga actually is. And people say, well, I don't intend to it, so it's okay. Really? Let me ask you this. If I stood up here and said, I want to get some exercise, but I'm not going to do anything religious to do my exercise. I'm going to keep getting that exercise, but I'm not doing anything religious. What are you going to say to me? I'm going to say, sorry, that's a sign of the cross that has its intrinsic meaning. It's the same thing with yoga. I've seen people become possessed from doing yoga, not even knowing that that's what actually is involved. So I tell people, stay away from it. It's the same thing with Enneagram. It's the same thing with a lot of the stuff that we're actually seeing.
The previous comments that you were making prior to this last question, I wanted to know if the prayers that a mother could say or whatever could go across the states.
Yeah. Wherever the prayer or ritual is done is distinct from where the effect takes place in the spiritual world. So that means that you can do the binding prayers or do certain things and pray for people at one location, the effect actually occurs in another. By the way, that structure things is what witches do all the time. They'll do a ritual in one place to affect people in a location, but they're just inverting that process. But we can do the same thing. We can be praying for people at a distance, and it has its effect.
Father, you said that Jesus in the cross restored humanity to perfection and with all the bad original sin created. And if Jesus is the new Adam, why is it that we still are born with the original sin?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, the church is very clear, the saints have been very clear, theologians throughout time have been very clear that the passion and death of our Lord is infinite in merits. But we know de facto that, so in its cause, it's infinite. But the application and its effect is limited. And it's not going to be until after the resurrection that the full effect of the passion will be, the effects of that cause will be made manifest. So right now, we still labor under those things, only because he hasn't fully applied the effects of the passion. That's one of the reasons why St. Paul says, through my own body I make up as lacking the sufferings of Christ. Not because they're not infinite, but because it's in us doing these things that merit from Christ is applied in our own lives. And so that's why it's ultimately because on the side of the cause it's infinite, but in the application it's finite.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering what you would say is the correlation or relationship of demonic possession and technology.
First of all, I am not a Luddite. I actually like technology. I'm a typical guy. I like gadgets. The technology is a good thing, but I subscribe to globalism. There's a philosopher named Globalism, and he made the observation that technology is a good thing, and every time you use it, you get a little bit of a pleasure out of it. And as a result, you can become very moderate. It's used because of the pleasure. We actually know this through a lot of brain studies. So that, for example, every time you look at your cell phone, look to see if there is a message, and there's a message that it's right? So they actually know that these things are actually occurring. And so he says, if you're going to use technology, he says there's nothing wrong with it, it's actually a good thing, but you have to be able to do some forms of penance. Keep this sense, or keep this ordered, or the intemperance at bay, basically. So technology is not a bad thing, but now what it's being used for is for a lot of evil. Statistically, I've read a number of different things, but statistically, they say that at any one given point in time in the United States, at the low point, it's about 35%. At the high point, it's 50% of the bandwidth on the internet is burned up by pornography. So technology is the gateway to a lot of people becoming diabolically influenced, not because the technology is evil in itself, because of the bad use of it. And so I think it's a good thing, but it's like anything else. I mean, if people don't have virtues who use it for the wrong ends and the wrong means. There is one thing that we've seen which is extraordinarily rare, and I'm not telling you should worry about this unless you have to have friends who are butchers or something, but they found that they can curse a text before they send it, and the person who reads it, they can become subject to curse. So we're seeing that. That's very, very rare. It just doesn't seem to have that effect. So I don't think that there's necessarily that much of a connection to possession, other than the fact that people are using it to open up the door to a sin that leads to possession.
So what should we do as parents that if we find out that one of our kids stumbles across porn, and it's happened in a lot of good faithful Catholic families that have tried to lock down everything, but we can't be everywhere at the same, wherever our kids are. So let's say one of our kiddos, very naively and innocent, stumbles into that, and of course with that dopamine rush gets a little bit further than what you would hope for. What do we do? I have the deliverance prayer book.
That's one of them, yeah.
Okay, so what prayers out of there specifically?
Well, one of the things you can do is concentrate, but you have to realize is that now, because this thing is now in his memory, in a certain sense, he's been wounded through the process, or she's been wounded through the process, in a sense, because now the cognitive power, imagination, or memory have this thing of this disorder. And so one of the things that you can do is actually pray for their healing, so pray for their healing. Having them pray for their healing. Also pray for the grace of forgetfulness, so that they forget it. Basically, it's not that you can't recall the thing, it's just that you don't recall it. It just doesn't come to mind. This is something that I recommend for people who view pornography in the past, or even in their own sin. Because a lot of times the imagery and experiences we have of our own sins become something that's confused, and you can ask for Our Lady for the grace of forgetfulness. The beauty of being a priest is that you're just constantly in the habit of that. I mean, what you're going to hear as a priest in the confessional, you're going to hear 99.9% of what you're going to hear from the rest of your priesthood in the first month. But after a while, you can't even remember anything, right? Which is kind of nice. But you usually don't remember stuff too often, too frequently. And so it's the grace of forgetfulness. So I'm asking for that. I think that also a lot of it depends on the circumstances. People ask me, well, how do you know the demon's going to get their foot in the door? That's pretty easy. Demons are showing. Stand, not being looked at and paid attention to. And so what it means is that once they get their foot in the door, they're going to start acting up. So a lot of times, I'll ask people, was there an event in your life after which you never felt the same? Now, for your kids, after that, their behavior seems to kind of go back to normal, and they just need a little bit of adjustment, and you're probably okay, at least on the side of the diabolic side. That doesn't mean, though, that they're not going to have to go through a healing process, and you're going to have to pray for that in relationships. So that's the short answer. I mean, obviously, there are some good Catholic therapists that may have to help the child fall that if they saw it like gruesome or something. But generally speaking, that's the process.
You mentioned that some extreme phenomena have occurred in front of you during exorcisms, like levitation and people morphing into a different shape. Have you ever recorded this on video, or have you ever had anyone come in to document that kind of thing?
The Vatican strictly forbids exorcisms to be videotaped. And I think there's a couple of reasons why. One is because the people who are possessed, they feel ashamed, even though they shouldn't necessarily be feeling ashamed. A lot of them are leading good, holy lives. So you're not allowed, there's that element. So it's a psychological element. The thing you always have to do, you have to be really careful too, is when you're working with people, you have to really know what you're doing, because if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, you can cause a tremendous amount of damage, and the demons can seize on that, and then it sets you back a few weeks in the process. So this is one of the reasons why you don't do it. The other part of it is, it's to protect the anonymity, sometimes of the exorcist, but also of the people that are helping the exorcist, also the people who are possessed. It's also done because there are times in which certain things will be said and done in the sessions, and the Vatican does not want that on videotape. But the primary reason, I think, is because they know once you do it, it's going to end up on the internet. The other part of it is they've, and all that does is fuel people's curiosity. They really like to see that. I don't think you do. Right? But the other thing is that, so it fuels people's curiosity. They do allow you to record the sessions if there is a sufficient reason for it. But they're getting very close. I heard there was some discussion, I haven't seen the documents, so they haven't come out with it, but they're even thinking of forbidding that to recording because of the fact that they're having problems with some of those showing up online. So the church is very careful about this. Part of it is too is because a lot of times, like I said, this stuff is really mundane and you don't really see a lot of those extraordinary things. And so if you're videotaping them and putting them out on the internet, people are going to that's just what I told you, because they're not going to see anything necessarily extraordinary. Because usually the preternatural signs occur at the beginning, periodically, once in a great while, then the third, and right at the end of the fifth stage. So that's the general parameters where you're going to see that. And so you don't see it most of the time.
I do believe that we are part of the mystical body of Christ. I would just like to ask if there are any prayers that we can add to our daily life in order that we can do our effort on our part, or you guys can do an effort on your part, so that we can help each other as church.
Yeah, there is. I think the principle, well, first of all, just becoming full of yourselves. But the other part of it is, as I mentioned, the group I was the only Christian one, because that's the one where, so the exorcists who pray that are enjoying the effects too, those prayers for their protection of their families, and also the liberation of the people that we're actually working with. And so in that particular case, the Auxiliary Christian is one of the principal ways. Sometimes you just offering up your prayers for them. But I'm going to make a recommendation that's really important. Don't pray for the people that I'm working with to get liberated directly. And the reason being is because you're likely to get retaliated against. Retaliation is a sign you're doing something that's probably a little over the top or not following the authority of God. The best thing to do is pray to our Lord and our Lady and ask them to liberate the person, to apply the effects of your prayers. And the way that works is because demons can't understand, they can't hear our thoughts unless we direct them to them. So as a result of that, what happens is that when you're directing your thoughts to our Lord and our Lady, they can't hear that. So when the effect occurs, they don't know what the cause is. So they're not going to retaliate against you. So there's a level of protection that you gain with that.
All right.
Good evening, Father. Could you speak to the dynamic or the interaction between our guardian angels and demons? Thank you.
St. Thomas in his commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences talks about what he calls prolation. And prolation, we get the word prelate from it in English, but prolation is the authority that one individual has over another. And so our guardian angels, technically speaking, because they've been consigned to us, have prolation in relationship to any demon that would afflict us. However, we know that there's times when they have to stand back and allow the temptation to occur because God wants it for the sake of our purification, our testing, etc. There's a funny story in Padre Pio used to see his guardian angel all the time. And then one time Satan shows up and is beating him up, and his guardian angel is nowhere to be found, and so his guardian angel shows up, and so Padre Pio chooses his guardian angel out. Right? So, but the point being is that the guardian angel in that moment is obedient to God. He said, no, I want this to happen for the sake of for this good to come about. And so they appear, the angels or guardian angels, they do actually help us in the way that we actually know that they're helping us as things are normal. Their goal is to get us to function as normally and as naturally as possible to follow God and His laws. Whereas demons are pulling us in the other direction. That's why it's easier for us to perceive that thing because it seems unnatural, the things that they do. Whereas our angels, when we're functioning well, that's a sign that every angel's doing his job. But they seem to be a little bit more limited in that relation, whereas our ladies, I mentioned, has perfect course of power of demons. In a certain sense, they all do. The biggest difference is that God seems to be much more fond of allowing Our Lady to use that as she wills. She just seems to be all over the place when it comes to all the exorcists talk about how she is so involved in so many cases of liberation. And so she just got more of her. But the guardian angels actually do protect us. And the way that you gain more protection from your guardian angels is by developing a relationship with them. You know, if you say, my guardian angel doesn't do anything, well, when was the last time you talked to him? Right? Well, I haven't talked to him in a couple of months. Well, then he's just waiting for you to talk to him. Okay? And the more you get them involved, the more they're actually capable of doing it. What's interesting about guardian angels, and I'm going to go into this, because I think we're at that time. When a priest gets ordained, he gets another guardian angel. So you have the guardian angel with which you're born with, but then when you become a priest, you get another guardian angel. When you get married, if it's a valid sacrament of marriage, God assigns another angel for marriage. Right? So you have a guardian angel of the marriage and of the family. But the guardian angel of the priesthood, it's interesting because the people that have seen these guardian angels, which I'll give an account of one once here in a minute, talk about how because in the spiritual realm, demons tell you that stature is everything. So how big of a guy you got tells you how important the priest is. Right? So, and they'll describe the exorcists, guardian angels, as these huge. Now, I'm not saying important. I tell people the reason I need such a big guardian angel is because I'm such a little guy. But the point is that they actually do. So one time there's one woman, and this will give you a sense of how much guardian angels love us, their compassion for us, and how they're just very quick to do what we need to do immediately. I tell people one of the most beautiful things about being an exorcist is, like, for example, one time I just said to Padre Pio, the student would sit still. So I just turned to Padre Pio and said, Nanta, would you get this guy under control? All of a sudden, the woman just goes, bam, down on the floor, and she's writhing around because the demon's manifest, right? Later, I asked her, well, what happened? I said, I don't know, I can feel his foot on my back. They're literally there, listening.